I am not a religious man. I want to make that clear before I tell you anything else. I am not someone who goes to church on Sundays, or reads scripture before bed, or believes that anything in this universe gives a single thought to what happens to Marcus Cole. I am a 43-year-old Army intelligence officer with 16 years of experience interrogating people in rooms that do not appear on any official record. I have sat across from terrorists, war criminals, men who had done things that would turn your stomach inside out. And I broke every single one of them. Not with violence, with patience, with silence, with the particular skill of making a man believe that I already know everything, and that his only remaining choice is how this ends for him. I was good at my job. I am telling you that so you understand what kind of man walked into that facility on the night of February 11th, 2024. Not a man looking for miracles, not a man open to anything he could not explain with logic and training, and 16 years of understanding exactly how human beings behave under pressure. What I encountered in that underground room was not human, and what it told me, I have spent every day since trying to decide whether the world deserves to know. I have decided it does. My son's name was Daniel. He was 9 years old when a drunk driver ran a red light on a Tuesday afternoon and took him from me. That was 3 years before any of this happened. 3 years of going through the motions of being alive without actually feeling like I was. My marriage didn't survive it. Nothing survives that kind of loss intact. You just become a version of yourself that functions, that shows up, that completes tasks. But somewhere underneath all of it, there is a place that has gone completely dark, and you have accepted that it is never coming back on. I stopped believing in God the day they buried Daniel. Not dramatically, not with anger at first, just a quiet internal door closing. If there was something out there capable of preventing that moment, and chose not to, then either it didn't exist, or it wasn't worth believing in. Either way, I was done. That is the man they called at 2 a.m. on February 11th. The call came from a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end identified itself as Colonel Sarah Webb. She told me I had been selected for immediate reassignment to a classified operation of the highest priority. She used a phrase I had never heard in 16 years of clearances and black operations and rooms that didn't exist. She said, "You are being granted cosmic clearance, Sergeant Cole." I had heard of cosmic clearance, the way you hear of things that exist at the edge of what is real, a level above top secret, above special compartmented information, a classification so rare that most people who work in intelligence their entire careers retire without ever encountering it. It is reserved for information that, if released to the general public, would not just cause panic, it would cause the complete collapse of the frameworks people use to understand reality. I asked her what this was about. She said, "You will be briefed on arrival. A vehicle is outside your building right now." I looked out my window. A black SUV was parked across the street, engine running, no plates. I had my jacket on before she finished speaking. They put a hood over my head before we left the city. Standard disorientation protocol. I counted time and turns the way I'd been trained to. But after 2 hours of driving, and then what felt like a cargo plane, and then more driving on what sounded like dirt roads, I had completely lost my orientation. I did not know what state I was in. I did not know what direction I was facing. I knew only that we had been going down for a long time when the vehicle finally stopped. The elevation drop was significant. We were deep underground. They took the hood off in a corridor. The walls were polished black. Not painted, coated in something that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. The ceiling was low. The air had the particular recycled flatness of somewhere that had not seen natural ventilation in a very long time. Armed personnel stood at intervals along the corridor. None of them made eye contact. None of them spoke. Colonel Webb was waiting at the end of the corridor. She was smaller than I expected from her voice. Late 50s. Silver hair pulled back tight. The kind of face that has made hard decisions. So many times the lines have become permanent. She shook my hand and said, "Thank you for coming on short notice, Sergeant." I said, "I didn't get the impression I had a choice." She almost smiled. "You didn't, Walk with me. We moved through 2 security checkpoints. Biometric. Retinal. At the second one, she handed me a single sheet of paper and told me to read it carefully. It was a non-disclosure agreement unlike any I had ever signed. The language was specific about things I had never seen referenced in any official document. It used terms like extra-dimensional biological entity, non-terrestrial consciousness, and cognito-hazard exposure protocol. I signed it because by that point, I needed to know what was behind that door. Webb stopped outside a reinforced door and turned to face me. She said, "What is inside this room has been in our custody for 11 months. In that time, it has refused to communicate meaningfully with anyone we have placed in front of it. Our linguists, our psychologists, our best interrogators. It speaks, it understands us perfectly. It simply chooses not to engage." I said, "Why me?" She said, "Because it asked for you specifically." I felt something move through my chest that I did not have a name for. I said, "It asked for me by name?" She said, "By name, by rank, by physical description. 3 weeks ago it ended 11 months of silence to tell us to bring you here. We don't know how it knows you exist. We don't know what it wants from you. Your job is to go in there and find out." Then she said the last thing before the door opened. She said, "Whatever it says in there, do not let it see that it has affected you. These things read emotional response the way we read body language. The moment it knows it has gotten to you, you lose whatever leverage you have." The door opened. The room was small. White walls, white floor, a single metal chair bolted to the center of the floor facing a transparent partition. On the other side of that partition was another chair, and in that chair was Subject Omega. I am going to try to describe what I saw accurately because I know what the human brain does when it encounters something it has no category for. It tries to force it into the nearest available category. It tries to make it make sense. So let me be precise. It was approximately the size and shape of a tall human being, seated, thin, in a way that suggested the bones underneath were arranged differently than ours. The skin, if you could call it that, was the same color as the walls. Not as camouflage, just its natural color. Almost white, with a faint luminescence underneath it, the way a screen glows faintly even when displaying a white image. The face was where the categories broke down completely. The proportions were almost right. Eyes, nose, mouth, almost. But the eyes were too large and completely black, and the mouth when it was closed seemed to have no lips, just a line. It was looking directly at me when I walked in, not at the door. Not at the room, at me, like it had been watching the door from the inside, and knew exactly when I would appear. I sat down in the chair across from it. I said, "My name is Marcus Cole." It said, "I know your name, Marcus. I know considerably more about you than your name." The voice was wrong, in a way that took me a moment to identify. It was not the accent, or the vocabulary. It was the resonance. It came from the right direction. But it felt like it was also coming from somewhere slightly behind my ears, like the sound was arriving through 2 channels simultaneously. I said, "Then you have an advantage. Why don't you tell me something about yourself?" It tilted its head, just slightly. It said, "You are grieving. You have been grieving for 3 years, 4 months, and 17 days. You count the days. You don't tell anyone that you count them, but you do. Every morning, I kept my face completely still. It said, the boy's name was Daniel. He liked drawing maps of places that didn't exist. He used to draw them on the back of your old mission reports when you brought work home. You still have 43 of them in a box under your bed." I said, "That is not relevant to why I am here." It smiled then. At least, the line of its mouth moved in the configuration that on a human face would indicate a smile. It said, "Everything is relevant, Marcus. That is one of the first things your kind gets wrong. You divide things into categories: relevant, irrelevant, important, unimportant, as though reality respects your filing system." I said, "Why did you ask for me?" It leaned back slightly in its chair, with the ease of something that has nowhere it needs to be. It said, "Because you are empty. The others they sent me were full of belief, or full of fear, or full of ambition. You are empty, An empty vessel is the only kind worth filling, I said. And what are you planning to fill me with? It looked at me for a long moment. It said, truth. The kind your species has been kept from for a very long time. The kind that will make everything you think you understand about your world, about your history, about what happens when that body of yours finally stops working, completely and permanently obsolete. I said, that is a significant claim. It said, I am a significant being. Your containment of me here is amusing. You believe these walls hold me. They do not. I remain because I choose to remain, because this conversation needed to happen, because you needed to be ready to hear it, and because the time, finally, is correct. I said, the time for what? It said, for you to understand what you are, what you were made for, and what is coming for every consciousness on this planet, whether your governments choose to acknowledge it or not. Then it said something that stopped me completely. It said, Daniel drew a map once, a map of a city with 7 rivers and a mountain in the center with a light at the top. He called it the city at the end of everything. You told him it was very good, and then you went back to your reports. You never asked him how he knew what that city looked like. My hands were flat on the table in front of me. I said, how do you know about that? It said, because Daniel did not imagine that city, Marcus. He remembered it. And what I am about to tell you is the reason why that is possible. I felt something happen in my chest that I'd not felt in 3 years, 4 months, and 17 days. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. And I knew then that whatever this thing was about to tell me, it was going to change everything. I have interviewed over 200 people in 16 years. I have sat across from men who had buried bodies in their backyards and smiled while describing it. I have sat across from people so broken by what they had seen in combat that they could no longer form complete sentences. I have sat across from individuals whose capacity for deception was so refined that detecting it required every skill. I had developed over a decade and a half of training. In all of that time, in all of those rooms, I had never once lost control of myself. I lost it then, not visibly. I want to be clear about that. My hands stayed flat on the table. My face stayed neutral. My breathing stayed even. 16 years of training does not disappear because something impossible is happening. But underneath all of that, underneath the professional surface, something had cracked open. Something that had been sealed shut for 3 years, 4 months, and 17 days. I said, very carefully, explain what you mean. About Daniel, about the city. Omega looked at me with those black eyes that reflected nothing. No light, no depth, just darkness that somehow still managed to convey something. That felt almost like patience. It said, your species has a concept you call déjà vu. The sensation of having experienced something before. You have dismissed it as a neurological glitch, a misfiring of memory systems. This is incorrect. What you experience as déjà vu is consciousness, recognizing a frequency it has encountered in a previous state of existence. Your son was not imagining that city. He was remembering a place his consciousness had already been. I said, you are telling me that Daniel had memories of somewhere he had never physically been. It said, I am telling you that the physical is the smallest and least significant layer of what exists. You have built your entire civilization on the assumption that what you can touch and measure and observe through instruments is the totality of reality. It is not even close. What you call reality is one frequency band out of an almost infinite spectrum. Your instruments cannot detect the others. Not because the others are not there, because your instruments were built by minds that were deliberately kept from understanding what to look for. I said, deliberately. By who? It said, by us, by my kind, and by others who had reasons of their own. The room felt smaller. Suddenly, I said, your kind suppressed human knowledge, intentionally. It said, for a very long time. Yes, though suppress is perhaps not the most accurate word. It was more like curation, careful management of what your species was allowed to discover and when. You were not ready. a species that cannot cross its own oceans without sinking half its fleet, is not a species ready to understand the architecture of consciousness and dimension. Knowledge without the wisdom to contain it is simply a faster path to destruction, I said. And now? Are we ready now? It tilted its head. In that way that was almost human. It said, no. But the timeline has changed. What is coming does not care whether you are ready. So the calculus has shifted. Ignorance was protective once. Now it is simply dangerous. I said, what is coming? It did not answer that immediately. It looked at me for a long moment, in silence. Then it did something I had not seen it do since I entered the room. It looked away, just briefly, at the wall to its left, like something had moved there that only it could see. Then it looked back at me. It said, before I answer that, I need you to understand the foundation. Because without the foundation, what is coming makes no sense. And what I am about to tell you will contradict everything your civilization has been taught about its own origins. I need you to be prepared for that. I said, I am a man who stopped believing in anything the day they put my 9-year-old son in the ground. I am prepared for anything. It said, good, then we begin. It settled back in its chair, and it began to speak in a way it clearly had not spoken to anyone in that facility before. Not in fragments, not in deliberate provocations, but in the measured, continuous way of something that had been waiting a very long time to say what it was about to say. It said, your universe is not an accident. It is not the result of a random collision of particles that happened against impossible odds to produce stars and planets and eventually biological life. It was designed, constructed, initiated by a consciousness so vast and so fundamental that every attempt your species has made to describe it has fallen catastrophically short. Your religions have called it God. Your physicists have called it the unified field. Your philosophers have called it the absolute. None of those labels are wrong exactly. They are all just descriptions of different parts of the same thing, seen from the outside by minds too small to see the whole. I said, you are telling me God is real. It said, I am telling you that what your species means by that word points at something real. Whether the word itself is adequate is another conversation. What matters is this: that consciousness, that fundamental frequency, did not create your universe and then step back. It is the universe. It is not separate from what exists. It is what exists. Every particle, every wave, every thought occurring in every mind across every dimension is an expression of that one base frequency, experiencing itself from an infinite number of perspectives. I sat with that for a moment, not because I accepted it, because my mind was trying to decide whether it was even possible to reject it properly. I said, if that is true, then why is there suffering? Why is there death? Why did my son die on a Tuesday afternoon? Because some man decided alcohol was more important than paying attention. For the first time since I entered that room, it paused, not dramatically, just long enough for me to notice. Then it said, because you are in a dimension of contrast. You cannot understand light without darkness. You cannot understand connection without loss. You cannot understand love, real love, the frequency of it, without understanding what its absence feels like. This dimension was designed as an experience, a school, if you want a simpler word. Consciousness comes here to feel the full spectrum, to make choices in conditions of genuine uncertainty, to discover what it is made of when it does not remember what it actually is. I said, what do you mean does not remember? It said, every consciousness that enters a physical body agrees to a limitation, a forgetting. The full awareness of what you are, of the dimensions you have already moved through, of the connections you carry, is suppressed when you enter biological form. Because if you remembered everything, the lesson would be meaningless. You cannot genuinely choose love over fear if you already know with certainty that love is the fundamental nature of reality. The choice has to feel real. The uncertainty has to be genuine. Otherwise, it is not growth. It is just performance. I felt something moving through my chest again, that dangerous feeling from before. I said, Daniel, when he died. Where did he go? Omega looked at me with those black eyes, and for the first time, something in its expression shifted. Not fear, not confusion, something I can only describe as gentle, which is a word I never expected to use about something that looked the way it looked. It said, "He did not go anywhere, Marcus. He returned." The body stopped. The biological receiver shut down, and the consciousness that had been using it, that had been compressed into it for 9 years, expanded back into its natural state, like a fist unclenching, like a breath finally released after being held too long. My jaw was tight. I kept my face still. I said, "Is he aware? Does he still exist as himself, as Daniel?" It said, "Consciousness does not cease. It cannot cease. That would require the base frequency itself to cease, and that is not possible. What you called Daniel, the specific pattern of awareness that looked at you with your same eyes and drew maps of cities he had never visited, that pattern does not dissolve. It continues, in a state of existence so far beyond what biological sensory equipment can process, that describing it in your language is like trying to describe color to someone who has only ever experienced sound. But yes, he exists. He is aware, and he carries everything that mattered from his time here." I said nothing for a very long time. Then I said, "The city, the one he drew, with the 7 rivers and the mountain and the light at the top." Omega said, "He had been there before this life, many times. It is a stable point between dimensions, a place consciousness gathers between experiences. He remembered it the way you might remember a home you grew up in. The geometry of it was in him before he was born into that body." I pressed my hands flat on the table to keep them steady. I said, "Why are you telling me this? What does any of this have to do with what is coming?" It said, "Because what is coming is a frequency event, a shift in the base resonance of this dimension. It happens in cycles. The last time it occurred, your species did not yet have written language. What follows such a shift is a period of accelerated awareness. The veil between what you experience as reality and what actually exists thins significantly. For some consciousness, this is an expansion. For others, for consciousness that has spent its time here moving consistently toward fear and isolation and disconnection, it is experienced as collapse." I said, "You are describing a judgment." It said, "I am describing a natural consequence. There is no judge. There is only frequency. Consciousness that has been vibrating at the frequency of love and connection and genuine care for other awareness finds the shift comfortable, natural, like finally breathing air that is actually clean. Consciousness that has been vibrating at the frequency of fear and isolation and predation upon other awareness finds the shift unbearable because the new resonance is incompatible with what it has become." I said, "When?" It did not answer immediately. That silence lasted longer than any of the others, long enough that I became aware of the room again. The walls, the chair, the glass between us, the fact that somewhere outside that room, there were people monitoring this conversation who had not said a single word since I entered. Then Omega said, "Sooner than your governments want to acknowledge, which is why certain entities have been accelerating their influence on human behavior, pushing your species toward fear, toward division, toward the particular isolation of a consciousness that believes it is alone and meaningless in a cold mechanical universe, because the species moving toward that frequency is far easier to manage through the shift." I said, "Your kind." It paused, just slightly, then said, "Some of my kind. We are not unified in our position regarding your species. We have never been. There are those among us who have spent a very long time invested in keeping you exactly where you are. And there are those fewer who believe what is happening to your species is a tragedy that does not have to continue." I said, "Which are you?" It looked at me for a long moment, then said, "I am here, Marcus. I asked for you by name. I am telling you things that certain members of my kind would consider a significant violation of a very old agreement. Does that answer your question?" I leaned forward then. Something had been building in me through the entire conversation. Something I had not planned to say. Something that had nothing to do with interrogation protocol, or intelligence gathering, or any of the 16 years of training that had brought me to that chair. I said, I forgive you. Whatever your kind has done to mine, I forgive it. What happened next, I cannot fully explain even now. Omega convulsed, not slightly, not a flinch. A full violent convulsion that threw it backward in its chair. Both hands shot up to cover its face. The sound it made was not a scream exactly. It was something below a scream. A frequency. Deep, raw, wrong. The kind of sound that does not belong in a body that size. It lasted 4 seconds. Then it stopped. Suddenly. Completely. Omega straightened slowly. Hands lowering. Those black eyes finding me again. When it spoke, its voice was different. The resonance had changed. Like something inside it had been displaced. It said, "Do not do that again." I said, "What did I just do?" It said, "Forgiveness is not an emotion for your kind, Marcus. It is a frequency, the highest one a biological consciousness can generate from inside this dimension. And at close range. Without warning, it is unbearable. It is the one thing our instruments cannot shield against. The one thing we have never found a counter to in all the time we have been watching your species." I stared at it. I said, "You are afraid of forgiveness." It said, very quietly, "We are afraid of what your species becomes when it chooses it consistently. Because a species operating at that frequency is not a species that can be managed, or contained, or directed. It becomes something else entirely, something that has happened only twice before in the history of this universe. And both times, it changed everything. Before I could respond, the lights in the room dropped to emergency red. An alarm began somewhere far above us, low, repetitive, vibrating through the floor more than the air. Omega looked up. For the first time since I entered that room, it looked alert, not calm, not composed. Alert, it said. "They know I have been speaking. There are those monitoring this facility, Marcus, who are not your government, and they do not want this conversation to reach the outside world." The door behind me burst open. Colonel Webb, 2 armed personnel behind her. She said, "We have a breach in sub-level 4. We need to move you now." I said, "I am not finished." Omega stood, for the first time. Full height. Wrong. Too tall. Too precise. It pressed one hand against the partition and said quickly, "Tell them everything. Every word. Because the only thing that shifts frequency faster than fear is truth. And the only thing that has ever frightened my kind is what humans become when they finally understand what they actually are." Webb grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the door. I looked back once. Omega was still there, hand against the glass, watching me go. The door sealed.